Sunninghill Park had 12 bedrooms, 12 bathrooms, and a swimming pool behind the walls of Windsor Forest. It was the first royal residence built from scratch in Britain in over a century, a wedding gift from the Queen. And no one who paid for it, built it, or bought it for £15 million ever managed to live there in peace. A house on this ground burned down before Princess Elizabeth could move in. The replacement was built for Prince Andrew and Sarah Ferguson, mocked as SouthYork, and abandoned after a 6-year marriage. It was sold to a Kazakh billionaire through offshore companies. He never moved in. The building rotted until it was demolished. Not through one catastrophe. Through 5 centuries of the same quiet failure. A house that absorbed every ambition placed upon it and gave nothing back. The site sits within what was once Windsor Forest. 5 miles from the castle, screened by mature trees and bounded by high walls, a parcel of crown land that had carried the name Sunninghill for half a millennium before anyone thought to build a modern house upon it. And by the time that house arrived, red brick, enormous, instantly mocked, the ground beneath it already held a pattern that would prove impossible to break. In 1511, a royal house stood here. Not a palace in the Whitehall sense, something smaller, seasonal, a place the crown kept for use when the court was at Windsor and the forest needed managing. By 1527, the glazier galleon Hone was fitting windows in the property in preparation for the visit of Princess Mary, Henry VIII's eldest daughter. The work was recorded in crown accounts, panes of glass for a house in the forest, ready for a princess who may or may not have stayed. That is the first thing to know about Sunninghill. It has been preparing itself for royal arrivals that do not go to plan since the reign of the Tudors. The name persisted through centuries during which the building itself did not. Houses rose, were altered, fell into disrepair, and were replaced. The forest shrank. The land around the estate was carved into smaller parcels as the great Windsor woodland gave way to the commuter settlements that now surround it. But the site retained its identity, and it retained something else. A particular relationship with the crown that would resurface, again and again, whenever the monarchy needed somewhere to put a domestic problem. That relationship is the hidden foundation of everything that follows. Sunninghill was never simply a private house that happened to be near Windsor. It was crown land, land whose ownership, use, and disposal were governed by the particular and often opaque mechanisms through which the monarchy manages its property. The crown estate, the privy purse, the Duchy of Lancaster, the royal household, these are not decorative titles. They are legal structures, each with its own rules about what can be bought, sold, leased, gifted, or quietly disposed of. And Sunninghill would pass through several of these structures before its story was over, each transition adding another layer of institutional complexity to a house that was meant to look simple, domestic, and modern. Most visitors to the Berkshire countryside would never see these structures. They would see trees, lawns, a long private drive disappearing behind a wall. That is the point. The institutional machinery that governs crown property is designed to be invisible, to present, on the surface, the appearance of ordinary ownership while operating, beneath that surface, through channels that the public cannot easily trace, and that even Parliament struggles to scrutinize. Sunninghill would eventually test those channels to their limit. But the ground was already laid, literally and institutionally, centuries before anyone involved in the later scandal was born. The hidden foundation was there from the start, beneath the lawns, beneath the gravel, beneath every version of the house that would rise and fall on this site. The same truth persisted. This was crown land, subject to crown logic, and crown logic does not operate by the rules that govern ordinary property. It does not require transparency. It does not invite scrutiny. It does not explain itself. And when, centuries later, a royal house on this ground was sold for £15 million through offshore structures that no one could fully trace, the opacity was not an aberration. It was the oldest feature of the site, older than the bricks, older than the walls, older than any of the families who had come and gone above it. In the 18th century, the site was simply a desirable piece of southern England, and the man who desired it was Jeremiah Crutchley. Crutchley bought the Sunninghill estate in 1769. He was a man of wealth and social ambition, the kind of figure the Thames Valley produced in quantity during the Georgian period, when proximity to Windsor was a form of currency, and a well-placed country seat could open doors that no amount of commercial success could unlock on its own. He did not want the existing house. He wanted what could replace it. He commissioned James Wyatt. By the late 1760s, Wyatt was establishing himself as one of the most fashionable and prolific architects in England. He would go on to design for George III at Windsor, to work on Fonthill Abbey for the eccentric William Beckford, a commission that would end in the spectacular collapse of the building's central tower, and to accumulate a reputation for ambition that occasionally outran his capacity to deliver. Wyatt was not a cautious architect. He was a man who believed in transformation, in the possibility of turning a site into something grander than its history warranted. At Sunninghill, the project was manageable in scale, but characteristic in ambition. A gentleman's seat, classical in proportion, designed to demonstrate that its owner belonged to the landscape as naturally as the oaks that surrounded it. Earlier wings of the old house were pulled down. New rooms rose in their place. Wyatt gave Crutchley what the era demanded, a building that looked as though it had always been there, as though its columns and its symmetry were the inevitable expression of the ground on which it stood. The trick was familiar. It was also, in the context of Sunninghill, deeply ironic. Crutchley had not inherited the estate. He had purchased it. The building was not the organic product of centuries of family occupation. It was a stage set, assembled in a matter of years by an architect who specialized in making the new look ancient. This is the pattern that runs beneath Sunninghill, like the clay beneath its foundations. Every owner, every builder, every royal occupant who came to the site arrived with the same impulse, to construct an image of settled domestic life on ground that had never actually sustained one. The Tudor house prepared for a princess who left no record of staying. The Georgian house was built by a purchaser performing inheritance he did not possess. And the house that would come next, the one the world would remember, would be built to stage a marriage that was already, by the time the mortar dried, beginning to fail. Wyatt's Sunninghill survived into the 19th century. The estate changed hands again, first to the Garth family, then through a succession of owners whose names the local record preserves without much detail. Families came and went with the rhythm that large country houses impose on their occupants. A generation of enthusiasm, when the grounds are planted and the rooms are furnished and the ambition is fresh. A generation of maintenance, when the house demands more attention than its owners have energy to give. And a generation of decline, when the gap between what the building requires and what the family can provide grows too wide to bridge, and a sale becomes inevitable. Each time the estate changed hands, the same transaction repeated itself. A new owner arrived with plans. The house was altered to fit a new set of aspirations. The grounds were reshaped. And then, after a period that was never quite long enough to feel permanent, the owner departed, and the house absorbed the next occupant's ambitions like water into clay. The building did not change its character through any of this. It deepened it. Sunninghill was becoming, decade by decade, a place that consumed intention, a site where domestic futures arrived with confidence and departed without ceremony. By the early 20th century, the house had become what so many houses of its kind had become, a property whose upkeep demanded more than its purpose could justify, stranded between the era that built it and the era that no longer needed it. The First World War took young men from every house in the county. The Second World War brought requisition, repurposing, and the particular neglect that falls on private property when a nation is occupied with survival. Sunninghill's fabric deteriorated. The rooms that Wyatt had designed to impress visitors now impressed no one, because no one came. The estate waited, as it had waited before, for someone with either the money or the authority to decide what it should be next. In 1945, that authority arrived, and it wore a crown. The Crown Estate Commissioners purchased Sunninghill Park in 1945. The timing was deliberate, though the domestic purpose behind it would not become public for another 2 years. Britain was emerging from the war. The monarchy, which had spent 6 years projecting solidarity and sacrifice from Buckingham Palace and Windsor Castle, staying in London during the Blitz, visiting bomb sites, refusing evacuation, was about to enter a new phase. The war years had been good for the institution's reputation. The peace years would require a different kind of performance, not endurance, but renewal. Princess Elizabeth, the heir presumptive, was 21 years old. She was expected to marry. And when she did, she would need a home. Not a palace, not a castle, but a house. Somewhere close to Windsor, set within its own grounds, private enough to allow the illusion of ordinary family life that the post-war public craved from its royal family. Sunninghill fit the brief. The estate was crown land once more. The old house, battered by wartime neglect but still standing, could be restored, adapted, made ready. The plan was modest by royal standards. No new construction, no grand design competition, simply the rehabilitation of an existing property for a specific and hopeful purpose. The future queen would begin her married life in a house in the forest, surrounded by the same trees that had screened royal visitors since the time of Henry VIII. The engagement to Prince Philip of Greece and Denmark was announced on the 9th of July, 1947. The country responded with an enthusiasm that surprised even the palace. After years of austerity, of rationing and rubble, and the gray weight of reconstruction, the prospect of a royal wedding carried an emotional charge that went far beyond protocol. Bread was still rationed. Clothing coupons were still in effect. The bomb sites of London had not yet been cleared. Against that backdrop, the prospect of a young princess settling into a house among trees, not a state apartment, not a wing of a palace, but a house with a garden and a future, carried a domestic warmth that the nation was desperate to feel. It was a small hope, placed on a specific site, given a name and an address. On the 30th of August 1947, the house burned down. The fire consumed the main building. The precise cause has never been firmly established in the publicly accessible record. Wartime neglect of the fabric, aging electrical systems, the particular vulnerability of a large house left under-maintained for the better part of a decade while the country attended to more pressing matters. The details of the ignition matter less than the totality of the outcome. The house that was meant to carry a royal marriage into the future was destroyed before the marriage had taken place. By January 1948, Elizabeth and Philip had leased Windlesham Moor in Surrey instead. A temporary arrangement, a practical solution, a footnote where a narrative should have been. Sunninghill had failed its first modern royal assignment. Not through scandal, not through expense, not through any of the forces that would later define the site. Through fire, through the straightforward destruction of a building that could not survive the gap between royal intention and physical reality. The ground remained. The trees remained. The name remained. But the house was gone. And for nearly 4 decades, nothing replaced it. That vacancy matters. Between 1947 and the mid-1980s, the site of Sunninghill Park existed as a kind of architectural pause, crown land, undeveloped, holding its shape without holding a building. The walled garden persisted. The grounds grew wilder. The approach roads led to an absence. In structural terms, the site's modern story begins not with construction, but with a void, a gap where a house should have been, left by a fire that erased a future before it could begin. When the next future came, it arrived with a brass band and a tabloid nickname and a budget that the public would never stop arguing about. In 1986, approximately 5 acres of the Sunninghill estate, centered on the old walled garden, were acquired from the Crown Estate on behalf of Queen Elizabeth II. The acquisition was a wedding gift. The Queen's second son, Prince Andrew, the Duke of York, had married Sarah Ferguson on the 23rd of July that year, in a ceremony at Westminster Abbey watched by an estimated global television audience of 500 million. They would need a home, and the Queen, drawing on the same instinct that had once earmarked the site for her own early married life, chose Sunninghill. The choice carried more weight than a simple property decision. In 1986, the British monarchy was enjoying a period of relative public warmth. Charles and Diana's wedding 5 years earlier had demonstrated the extraordinary reach of a royal marriage as spectacle. And Andrew, the war hero of the Falklands, the prince the tabloids still called Randy Andy with more affection than malice, was considered a genuine national favorite. His bride was similarly popular. Sarah Ferguson was not a conventional aristocratic match. She was energetic, red-haired, outspoken, visibly delighted to be joining the family. The press, for a brief window, found her charming rather than excessive. And the house that the Queen chose for them was meant to match that energy. Modern, purpose-built, a break from the inherited gloom of older royal residences. The architect was Sir James Dunbar Nasmyth. He was not a tabloid figure, and he was not a society decorator. He was a conservation architect of serious professional standing, a man who had worked on Balmoral, who understood the particular demands that royal commissions place on a designer, and who brought to the Sunninghill project a sobriety of intention that the finished building would never be allowed to keep. Dunbar Nasmyth was given a brief that was, on paper, straightforward. Design a substantial family house suitable for a working member of the royal family, his wife, and their future children, on a site within Windsor Forest. The specifications told a different story. 6 reception rooms, 12 bedrooms, 12 bathrooms, staff quarters, a swimming pool, tennis courts, extensive landscaped gardens within the old walled enclosure, security infrastructure appropriate to a royal residence. The house was to be, in everything but name, a small palace, one that would need to function as a venue for official entertaining, a base for royal operations, and a family home, all simultaneously, all behind the same red brick walls. Construction began in 1987. By the time the house was completed in 1990, it had become the first newly built royal residence in Britain since Bagshot Park was constructed for Prince Arthur, Duke of Connaught, in 1879. More than a century had passed since the monarchy had built a house from scratch. The institution that prided itself on tradition, on the inheritance of ancient spaces, on the continuity between past and present that its palaces were designed to embody, had broken its own pattern. Sunninghill was not inherited. It was not adapted. It was new. And the newness was precisely the problem. Dunbar Nasmyth designed the house in red brick, at the scale and in the horizontal style he chose, broad, angular, emphatically contemporary, the material invited comparison that no royal building should ever invite. The press, already disposed to find the Yorks entertaining rather than dignified, landed on the nickname almost before the scaffolding came down. SouthYork. A play on SouthYork, the ranch from the American television series Dallas, which had become, by the late 1980s, international shorthand for a particular kind of ostentatious, televised, fundamentally unserious wealth. Others compared the building to a supermarket, others to a provincial leisure center. The assessments were ungenerous, sometimes cruel, and not entirely wrong. The house's horizontal sprawl, its geometric regularity, and its sheer footprint made it read, from the public road, as something closer to commercial than domestic. The deeper cruelty is that Dunbar Nasmyth was not an incompetent architect. His later obituaries would record a career of careful, intelligent work on historic buildings. He understood materials, context, and proportion. But the brief itself contained a contradiction that no architect could have resolved. The house needed to be large enough to function as a working royal residence, with all the operational infrastructure that implied, and simultaneously small enough in feeling to look like a private family home. Those two requirements, at the scale the Duke and Duchess of York needed, were mutually exclusive. The operational requirement won, the domestic illusion lost, and the building, from the day it was finished, carried the cost of that defeat in every headline. Andrew and Sarah moved in. Princesses Beatrice and Eugenie were born, Beatrice in 1988, during construction, Eugenie in 1990, the year the house was completed. For a brief period, months rather than years, Sunninghill functioned as what it was supposed to be, a family home, occupied by a married couple with 2 small daughters, set behind high walls in the commuter belt of southern England. The official photographs from this period show exactly what the palace press operation wanted the public to see. Andrew and Sarah on the grounds, the children on the lawn, the red brick facade as backdrop, solid, settled, new but permanent. The performance was convincing, but the audience had already made up its mind. From the moment the Yorks moved in, Sunninghill Park existed in two registers simultaneously. Behind the walls, it was a domestic space, children's bedrooms, a nursery, the particular chaos of a household with two daughters under the age of 5. Beyond the walls, it was a symbol, and the symbol was already contaminated by the time the family unpacked. Sarah Ferguson had become, by the early 1990s, one of the most publicly scrutinized women in Britain. Her spending habits, her weight, her friendships, her holidays, her clothes, her manner. Everything was material for a tabloid press that had decided, with the collective certainty that tabloids specialize in, that the Duchess of York was excessive, not wicked, not dangerous, simply too much spending, too much enthusiasm, too much appetite for a life that the press believed a royal duchess should not visibly enjoy. Sunninghill became the stage on which this narrative was performed, whether Sarah chose it or not. The house's size was evidence. Its cost was evidence. Its nickname was evidence. The swimming pool, the tennis courts, the 12 bathrooms. Every amenity that Dunbar Nasmyth had included because the brief required it, became, in the tabloid account, proof of the Duchess's extravagance. The red brick walls that the architect had intended as solid and traditional were read as garish and self-important. The building was tried and convicted in newsprint long before anything had actually gone wrong inside it. But things did go wrong inside it. Andrew was frequently away, first on naval duties, then increasingly on trade envoy engagements that took him to the Gulf states, to Asia, to wherever British commercial interests required a royal handshake. The absences were not unusual for a working member of the royal family, but they left Sarah alone in a 12-bedroom house that had been designed for a couple, and felt, when occupied by one person and two small children, less like a home than a facility. The corridors were long. The reception rooms were sized for official entertaining, not for an evening with the television. The scale that had been meant to impress visitors now impressed upon the sole occupant the fact that the house was built for a version of life that was not being lived. Sarah, meanwhile, was frequently in the press, for reasons she did not always control and could never adequately defend against. Her friendships were scrutinized. Her spending was catalogued. Her weight was monitored with a viciousness that said more about the tabloid culture of the early 90s than it did about any individual woman's body. The combination of Andrew's absence and Sarah's exposure left the house occupying an uncomfortable middle ground, too public to offer privacy, too private to allow its occupant to fight back. Sunninghill could not protect the family within its walls because the family's difficulties were not architectural. They were personal, financial, relentlessly publicized, and accelerating. By 1992, the marriage was visibly failing. In August of that year, photographs were published showing the Duchess on holiday in the south of France, with the Texan financial manager John Bryan, in circumstances that eliminated any remaining ambiguity about the state of the relationship. The press response was not merely hostile. It was gleeful. The woman the tabloids had already decided was too much had now provided them with proof of the specific kind of too much they had always suspected. The formal separation between Andrew and Sarah was announced shortly afterwards. Sunninghill's meaning shifted, permanently and irreversibly. It was no longer the home of a young royal family. It was the scene of a marriage that had collapsed in the most humiliating terms the British press could construct. What happened next was structurally revealing. Sarah did not leave Sunninghill immediately. She continued to live there, at least part of the time, in an arrangement that was financially tangled and publicly uncomfortable. The house built to celebrate a union now contained its wreckage. Two people whose marriage had ended were connected by a building that neither of them quite owned in any normal sense. The property sat within a web of crown interest, royal funding, lease arrangements, and family obligation that made a clean departure impossible without institutional negotiation. Andrew and Sarah occupied the same house as separated people. They shared corridors, shared a kitchen, shared the view of the same grounds. But the domestic reality that the architecture had been designed to frame no longer existed. The house had become a container for an absence. The house did not care whether the marriage survived. It required heating through the winter months. It required grounds maintenance in every season. It required security, staffing, insurance, and the rolling program of small repairs that every large building demands whether anyone is happy inside it or not. The costs continued. The marriage ended. The meaning changed. And the meaning that attached itself most stubbornly was debt. Sarah Ferguson's financial difficulties were reported throughout the 1990s with a persistence that bordered on obsession. By some accounts, her debts reached several £1,000,000. The details shifted with each retelling, but the shape of the story remained constant. A woman living in a house she could not afford, attached to a family she had embarrassed, carrying obligations she could not meet. Sunninghill was not merely her address. It was the most visible evidence that the life the house had been designed to contain had exceeded every budget, emotional, reputational, and financial, that anyone had set for it. The building, of course, did not register any of this. It sat behind its walls, red brick and resolute, absorbing the headlines the way its foundations absorbed the damp of the Berkshire clay. It had been built to last. It had not been built for this. The divorce was finalized in May 1996. By then, Sunninghill Park had spent a full decade absorbing scandal, and the damage showed, not in the fabric, not yet, but in the way the house existed in the public imagination. It was no longer a residence in any meaningful sense of the word. It was a prop, a shorthand. The red brick facade in the background of every photograph was not architecture anymore. It was a caption: excess, failure, embarrassment, the York brand reduced to a building that even its defenders struggled to love. The financial terms of the divorce were never fully disclosed, but the settlement left Sarah Ferguson in a position that the press described, with varying degrees of accuracy and sympathy, as catastrophic. Her debts were widely reported to run into several £1,000,000. She would spend the next decade attempting to rebuild her finances through book deals, television appearances, and commercial endorsements that often created more tabloid coverage than revenue. And through all of it, Sunninghill remained, the house where the failed marriage had played out, the most expensive set piece of a life that the public had decided was defined by overspending. Andrew remained. He continued to use Sunninghill as his principal residence, though the house, built for a family of 4, a couple and 2 daughters with staff, now housed a man whose public role was contracting and whose private circumstances had been exposed to a degree that few members of the modern royal family had endured. The building's operational demands did not contract to match. 12 bedrooms, 12 bathrooms, 6 reception rooms, a swimming pool, grounds that needed mowing, hedges that needed cutting, gutters that needed clearing. A house this size requires the same infrastructure whether it shelters a household or an individual. The heating runs, the security perimeter holds, the bills arrive. Then, in 2002, the Queen Mother died at Royal Lodge, Windsor Great Park, at the age of 101. Her death triggered a sequence of property decisions within the royal estate, decisions that, in any other family, would have been handled by solicitors and estate agents, but in the Windsor family were handled by the intersection of crown law, household tradition, and private negotiation. Royal Lodge, a substantial grace and favor residence with its own extensive grounds, became available. Prince Andrew expressed his wish to move there. The royal household confirmed that the Duke of York planned to dispose of his lease at Sunninghill Park and relocate. That word, dispose, not relinquish, not sell with regret, not even vacate, which would at least acknowledge that the place had been lived in. Dispose, the language of a liability, not a home. The building that had been presented to the nation as a wedding gift from the Queen, as a symbol of modern royal domesticity, as the first purpose-built royal house in more than a century, was now openly treated as something to be got rid of, so that a better property could be obtained. The emotional arc was complete. Gift to burden. Celebration to disposal. 12 years of marriage, 4 years of post-divorce occupation, and the house had been reduced to a line on a list of assets requiring resolution. The mechanics of the move were themselves revealing. Andrew did not simply hand back the keys to Sunninghill and collect the keys to Royal Lodge. The two properties operated within different parts of the royal estate system. Royal Lodge was a grace and favor residence, provided by the Crown, whose occupation carried certain understandings about use and maintenance. Sunninghill involved a lease arrangement connected to the original Crown estate acquisition and the Queen's gift. Disentangling one property and entering the other required the kind of institutional negotiation that the royal property system excels at conducting and excels at keeping from public view. The results were visible. Andrew at Royal Lodge, Sunninghill empty, but the process was opaque, conducted through channels that the public had no means of observing and no standing to question. Sunninghill sat empty. The house, vacated, began the long transition from residence to liability to ruin. Without daily occupation, without heating cycling through the system during the cold months, without the constant small maintenance that keeps a large building alive, the clearing of a blocked gutter, the fixing of a cracked seal, the airing of rooms that would otherwise grow damp, the fabric started its slow surrender to the climate. Berkshire is not a harsh county, but it is a wet one. Moisture is patient. It finds every crack, every failing joint, every place where the maintenance has stopped. And at Sunninghill, the maintenance had stopped entirely. The grounds deteriorated in parallel. The lawns that had been mowed to royal specification grew long, then rough, then wild. The swimming pool, drained, collected rainwater, and the slow organic debris of seasons passing without intervention. The tennis courts cracked. The hedges, untrimmed, began to lose the geometric formality that had once distinguished them from the surrounding woodland. From the private road, if you could see past the walls, the house still stood. Red brick, intact in outline, but the details were softening. Paint flaked. Windowsills darkened with damp. The building was not collapsing. It was simply ceasing to be maintained, which for a house of this scale and this exposure amounts to the same thing, only slower. But the house was not abandoned. Not officially. It was for sale. The asking price was £12 million, a figure that reflected the land, the location, the 5 acres within the Crown estate perimeter, and whatever residual cachet attached to a property that could still, despite everything, be described as a former royal residence. £12 million for a house no one had lived in happily, on ground that had never sustained a domestic future for more than a few years at a time. The buyer, when he came, would not pay $12 million. He would pay 15, £3 million above the asking price, from a purchaser whose name would not be publicly confirmed for years, whose money would arrive through a chain of offshore companies and trust structures registered in jurisdictions designed for exactly this kind of opacity, and who would never, not once, not for a single night, sleep in the house he had bought. That sale is where the building's true darkness begins. Everything before it, the Tudor origins, the Georgian ambitions, the royal fire, the tabloid marriage, the divorce, the debt, was prologue. What came next would strip Sunninghill of its last pretense, that it was, or had ever been, a home. Ayu's owner of Sunninghill, from the Tudor crown to Crutchley to the Crown estate to Andrew and Sarah, had at least intended to live there. The intention had often failed. The houses had burned, decayed, embarrassed their occupants, and been abandoned. But the original purpose had always been domestic. Kulibayev's purchase removed even that pretense. The house was not bought to be lived in. It was not bought to be admired. It was not bought to be restored or demolished or reimagined. It was bought, and then it was held. The distinction between a home and a holding is the distinction between a building that serves the people inside it and a building that serves a balance sheet somewhere else. Sunninghill, in its Kazakh phase, served the balance sheet. The people were irrelevant. There were no people. This is the point where the building's hidden foundation, the institutional opacity that had always governed the site, became indistinguishable from the building itself. Crown land had always been opaque. The royal property system had always operated through channels the public could not see. But those channels had at least supported habitation. Someone had always lived at Sunninghill, or been intended to live there. The Kazakh purchase stripped away even that function. What remained was pure structure, ownership without occupation, value without use, a transaction without a purpose that anyone involved had any need to explain. The hidden foundation had always been there, beneath the lawns and the gravel and every version of the house. Crown land, Institutional opacity. Structures designed to keep the public from seeing how royal property actually moved. Now, in the Kazakh sale, that foundation had risen to the surface. The entire transaction was opacity. The house itself had become the hidden thing, a building no one could see into, owned by entities no one could trace, purchased with money no one could fully account for. The domestic facade that Dunbar Nasmyth had built in red brick was now wrapped in a legal facade far more impenetrable, and behind both there was nothing. No family, no occupation, no life, just a house, standing in its grounds, waiting for no one. The photographs began to circulate within 2 years of the sale. By 2009, images of Sunninghill Park showed a building in visible decline. Not the dramatic ruin of a fire or a flood, but the quieter, more corrosive ruin of neglect. Doors stood open to the elements. Windows were cracked or broken, some with panes missing entirely. The swimming pool, which had once been heated and maintained for royal use, sat empty, its basin collecting rainwater and organic debris, weeds pushing through the cracked tiles at its edges. The paving around the pool had buckled and split. The lawns had become meadow. The formal planting, the hedges, the borders, the ornamental trees that had been selected and placed to give the grounds an air of established dignity, had surrendered to whatever the wind and the birds deposited. The contrast with what the house had been was not subtle. Fewer than 20 years earlier, this had been a working royal residence, staffed, heated, maintained, secured, visited by members of the royal family, photographed for official purposes, the subject of planning applications and architectural assessments. Princesses Beatrice and Eugenie had learned to walk on these lawns. Official guests had been received in these reception rooms. The swimming pool had been filled, heated, and used by children whose grandmother was the Queen of England. Now the pool was a basin of stagnant water and dead leaves, and the reception rooms were empty cavities where damp was doing what damp does when it meets plasterboard, and there is no one to stop it. Inside, the decay was more advanced than the exterior suggested. Water damage was reportedly extensive, not the catastrophic damage of a burst pipe, but the cumulative damage of years without heating, without ventilation, without the daily human presence that keeps a building's atmosphere in equilibrium. Moisture had taken hold of the interiors with the patience that moisture always brings. Damp bloomed across walls in dark patches. Plaster softened and flaked. Condensation formed on cold glass and ran down frames, pooling on sills, feeding the quiet biological processes that turn wood soft and paint to powder. The particular smell of a large house left unoccupied, mildew, stillness, the cold exhalation of rooms that no one enters and no one airs, would have been present in every corridor. The 12 bedrooms that Dunbar Nasmyth had designed for a royal family were empty. The 6 reception rooms were empty. The bathrooms, 12 of them, stood unused, their chrome fittings dulling, their seals perishing, their purpose extinct. The local authority in the royal borough of Windsor and Maidenhead was aware of the property's condition. Neighbors and local officials reportedly raised concerns about the state of the site, not out of affection for the building, but out of the practical anxiety that an abandoned property generates in any community. An empty house attracts vandalism, attracts trespassers, attracts the slow accumulation of problems that eventually become someone else's responsibility. Sunninghill was not a terraced house on a residential street. It was a substantial building on a significant site, and its visible deterioration was an embarrassment to a borough that prided itself on the quality of its built environment. But there was little the council could do. The property was privately owned. The owner, or rather, the offshore structure that held the ownership, was under no obligation to maintain the building to any standard beyond basic safety. Planning enforcement could address specific hazards, a collapsing wall, an unsecured structure that posed a risk to trespassers. It could not compel an absent owner to heat a house, mow a lawn, or repair a window simply because the decay offended the neighbors. The legal framework that governs property maintenance in England is built on the assumption that owners occupy or let their buildings, that the self-interest of habitation provides a natural incentive for upkeep. When that assumption fails, when a building is held as an asset rather than used as a shelter, the framework has almost nothing to say. Sunninghill was trapped in the particular limbo that expensive properties enter when their owners have no interest in occupation and no financial incentive to maintain, too valuable to demolish without permission, too neglected to inhabit, too legally complex to intervene in. The house existed in a space that the planning system was not designed for and the property market did not care about. Its value was in the land, not the building. The building was, in accounting terms, a depreciating structure on an appreciating site. The rational economic response to that equation is exactly what happened. Let the structure depreciate, wait for the land to appreciate, and demolish the building when the gap between the two becomes large enough to justify the cost of replacement. The building's wildlife, meanwhile, was thriving. Bats had colonized parts of the structure. In British planning and conservation law, bat roosts are protected, a legal fact that would prove consequential. Any proposal to demolish or substantially alter a building containing a bat roost requires a license from Natural England, and the process of obtaining that license involves surveys, mitigation plans, and timescales that are measured in months and years, not weeks. The bats did not know they were living in a former royal residence. They knew only that the building was dark, undisturbed, and structurally hospitable to roosting, which is to say, it was falling apart in exactly the ways that suit a bat colony. The creatures that had moved into Sunninghill were, in their own way, the most successful occupants the house had ever had. They required nothing from it except decay. Demolition permission was eventually sought and granted. The process was not swift. Planning applications, bat surveys, environmental impact assessments, consultations with Natural England, the procedural machinery that governs the destruction of a building in a sensitive and prominent location. All of it took time. The house that had been built in 3 years between 1987 and 1990 took considerably longer to be approved for removal. There is something fitting in that asymmetry. Construction is fast because someone wants it. Demolition is slow because no one takes responsibility for an absence. The planning system is not designed to expedite the destruction of property, even property that everyone agrees has no remaining value as a building. It is designed to ensure that destruction, when it comes, is orderly. And orderliness, in a case involving bats and offshore ownership and a former royal residence, takes time. The demolition itself, when it finally came, was conducted without ceremony. There was no public event. There were no speeches. No member of the royal family attended or commented. No heritage organization intervened to save a building that no one regarded as worth saving. The red brick walls that had been mocked as SouthYork, that had sheltered a royal marriage and then a royal divorce, that had absorbed a decade of tabloid ridicule and then a decade of vacancy, were taken down piece by piece and carted away. The swimming pool was filled in. The foundations were cleared. The ground was leveled. What had taken 3 years and millions of pounds to build was undone in a matter of weeks, and the only mourners were the bats. By 2016, the building was gone. The site was cleared. The ground, the same ground that had held a Tudor house, a Georgian mansion, a post-war ruin, and a late 20th century royal embarrassment, was bare once more. The trees remained. The walls remained. The name remained. But the house, for the second time in the site's modern history, had been erased. In 1947, fire had done the work. In 2016, it was a planning application, a bat survey, and a demolition contractor. The cause was different. The outcome was identical. Sunninghill was, once again, a place where a house had been and no longer was, an address without a building, a site waiting for the next structure to rise and the next domestic intention to fail. The parallels were exact enough to feel deliberate, though of course they were not. No one planned the fire. No one planned the abandonment. No one planned for bats to roost in the ceilings of a royal residence and delay its demolition by months. The site simply produced these outcomes, or more accurately, the site attracted the kind of grandiose intention that, when it met reality, consistently generated anticlimax, vacancy, and erasure. The pattern was not supernatural, it was structural. The gap between what Sunninghill was asked to be and what it could actually sustain was present in every chapter of its history, from the Tudor windows fitted for a princess who did not stay to the £15 million house that no one ever occupied. Permission was granted for a new house on the site. The planning application described a substantial modern mansion, larger in fact than the building it would replace, designed to contemporary standards, occupying the same walled enclosure that had held Dunbar Nasmyth's red brick original. The application moved through the Royal Borough of Windsor and Maidenhead's Planning Committee. It was approved. Construction began. And the site, which had been bare ground for the second time in its modern history, received its third purpose-built house in fewer than 3 centuries. The contrast between the demolition and the construction tells you something about the economics of prime land in southern England. The house that was torn down had cost millions to build in the late 1980s. It had been sold for $15 million in 2007. It had then been left to rot for nearly a decade, demolished at further expense, and replaced by a new building whose construction costs, while not publicly disclosed, would have been substantial by any measure. The total expenditure across the cycle, construction, maintenance, sale, vacancy, demolition, reconstruction, represents a sum that could have housed hundreds of families, funded a school, built a hospital wing. At Sunninghill, it produced 2 empty houses in succession. The economics of extreme wealth do not operate by the logic of utility. They operate by the logic of asset management, and asset management does not require that a house be lived in. It requires only that the land appreciate. The replacement mansion is, by most accounts, an impressive structure. It is larger than the house it replaced, finished to a high specification, set within landscaped grounds that have been restored to something approaching the formality of the original design. It has none of the architectural associations that doomed its predecessor. It does not look like a supermarket. It does not look like SouthYork. It carries no tabloid nickname. It lacks the emotional charge of a royal wedding gift or the reputational contamination of a royal divorce. It looks like what it is, an expensive house in the commuter belt, built for a wealthy owner, screened from public view by the same mature trees and high walls that have always defined the site. And according to recent reporting, most notably in The Sun, the replacement mansion has itself sat empty. The details are not fully confirmed in official documentation, and the claim should be treated with the caution that any assertion about a private property's occupancy deserves. But, if the reporting is accurate, and multiple outlets have repeated the claim without contradiction, then the pattern is complete. A new house, built on the site of the old house, standing in the same grounds, behind the same walls, and occupied by no one. The site has consumed another building, or more precisely, the site has produced another vacancy, another structure whose purpose was declared at conception and abandoned before habitation. The public cannot visit. There is no heritage trail, no blue plaque, no guided tour of the grounds where a royal marriage was staged, and a royal reputation was lost. The private road that leads to the site is not accessible to pedestrians or casual drivers. The walls are high, the trees are dense. The screening that was originally designed to give a royal household its privacy now gives an offshore-owned property its anonymity. Whatever the replacement house looks like from the inside, whatever condition it stands in today, the public will not know unless reporting or photography penetrates the perimeter. The site has returned to the state it occupied for most of its 5-century history, screened, enclosed, answerable to no one who does not hold the deed. The institutional structures that governed Sunninghill's ownership when it was Crown land have been replaced by the offshore structures that govern its ownership now. The mechanism is different. The effect is identical. The public sees trees and walls. What happens behind them, who owns the land, through what vehicle, under what terms, and for what purpose, is not a matter of easy public knowledge. Timur Kulibayev's name remains attached to the site in reporting, though the precise current ownership structure, which entities hold the freehold, which hold the lease, which trusts or companies sit between the beneficial owner and the land, is not a matter of straightforward public record. The opacity that characterized the 2007 sale has not diminished with time. If anything, it has deepened. The layers of legal structure that separated the buyer from the purchase have been joined by the layers of time, corporate reorganization, and jurisdictional complexity, that accumulate around any offshore-held asset over the course of nearly 2 decades. To trace the ownership of Sunninghill Park today would require access to company registries in multiple jurisdictions, trust documentation that may never have been filed publicly, and the cooperation of legal professionals in several countries. The site that began as Crown land, the most institutionally opaque form of property ownership in England, has found in its offshore afterlife a form of opacity that the Crown estate never achieved. Andrew, meanwhile, remains at Royal Lodge, the property whose acquisition was funded in part by the proceeds of the Sunninghill sale. His own position within the royal family has contracted dramatically since the sale, for reasons that have nothing to do with Sunninghill and everything to do with subsequent controversies that fall outside the scope of this story. But the financial chain remains legible. A wedding gift from the Queen, built on Crown land, occupied for a failed marriage, sold to a Kazakh billionaire through offshore structures for $3 million above asking, and the proceeds channeled into the renovation of a grace and favor residence that Andrew now occupies under terms that have themselves become the subject of public scrutiny and royal negotiation. Even the money has not settled. Even the proceeds of the Sunninghill sale continue to generate questions that the royal property system is not designed to answer. The money moved. The houses changed. The opacity persisted. And at Sunninghill, the ground that had carried royal intention since the reign of Henry VIII, held once again a building that no one appeared to live in. Stand back from the detail. Set aside for a moment the individual names: Crutchley, Wyatt, Elizabeth, Philip, Andrew, Sarah, Dunbar Nasmyth, Kulibayev, and look at the site across its full span. 5 centuries of recorded history. Multiple buildings, multiple owners, royal and private, Georgian and modern, cherished and abandoned. And through all of it, a single pattern, repeating with a consistency that begins to feel less like coincidence and more like the logic of the ground itself. Every owner arrived at Sunninghill with a domestic intention. Gallion-Hone fitted windows for a princess who left no trace of staying. Crutchley built a Georgian seat to perform an inheritance he had purchased. The Crown estate bought the property for a young princess, whose house burned before she could move in. The Queen gifted the site for a marriage that collapsed within a decade. Kulibayev bought the house for £15 million and never spent a night there. Each time, the intention was domestic. Each time, the outcome was vacancy, embarrassment, or absence. The site did not deepen its occupants. It flattened them, reducing each one to whatever function the house currently required. Hopeful newlywed, tabloid caricature, discreet seller, absentee owner. No one who entered the story of Sunninghill left it enhanced. Everyone left it diminished, embarrassed, or simply erased. The building that most people remember, the red brick SouthYork, with its 12 bedrooms and its swimming pool and its tabloid nickname, was not an anomaly in the site's history. It was the purest expression of it. A house built to manufacture the appearance of domestic happiness on ground that had never sustained domestic happiness for longer than a few years at a time. The performance was elaborate, the set was expensive, the audience was global, and the production closed early, as every production at Sunninghill always had. What Sunninghill reveals, and this is the building's only lasting contribution to understanding, is how royal domesticity functions as a financial instrument. The house was conceived as a gift. It was experienced as a stage set. It was maintained as an obligation. It was sold as an asset. And at each stage, the emotional language, wedding, home, family, marriage, was wrapped around a transaction that operated by entirely different rules. Crown land was acquired. A lease was created. Public money funded construction. A divorce redistributed use. A sale generated capital. Capital funded the next property. The feelings were real. The finances were separate. And when the feelings failed, the finances continued without them, as finances always do. The hidden foundation was never the clay beneath the building or the ancient royal claim on the forest. It was the institutional machinery, the Crown estate, the trusts, the offshore vehicles, the lease arrangements, that sat beneath every version of the house and outlasted every version of the life it was supposed to contain. The domestic surface was always temporary. The financial infrastructure was permanent. And when the surface cracked, as it always did, what showed through was not darkness in any melodramatic sense. It was something quieter and more structural. The revelation that the house was never really a house. It was a position in a portfolio, held in different forms by different entities across different centuries, and the families who lived there were tenants of a system that would survive them all. The wedding gift was not a gift. It was an allocation. The marriage was not a home. It was a tenancy. The sale was not a transaction between individuals. It was a transfer between structures. And the vacancy that followed was not neglect. It was the natural state of a property that had fulfilled its only real function, the conversion of royal sentiment into transferable value, and had nothing left to do. Sunninghill Park is gone. The replacement stands in its place, behind the same walls, among the same trees, on the same ancient ground. Whether it is occupied or empty, the site continues to do what it has always done. It holds its shape. It carries a name. It waits, with the patience of land that has outlasted every building placed upon it, for the next intention that will not be fulfilled, the next domestic future that will not arrive, the next owner who will discover what every owner before them discovered, that Sunninghill does not give back what is put into it. It absorbs ambition. It absorbs money. It absorbs hope, and it persists, indifferent, enclosed, and quiet, long after the people who brought those things have gone.